By Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank is a political analyst.
Keep going.
Thomas Frank is a political analyst who joins us here. He's written numerous books. Let me just say what he's done. Thomas Frank is a political analyst, historian, journalist, columnist for The Guardian. Written his book that we all know him about, What's the Matter with Kansas. Jacqueline Lookman is next to him. Jacqueline Lookman is co-editor of the social media outlet Lookman Nation. Good to have you with us as well. Eugene Puryear is with us, who's joined us many times here in The Real News. He's a journalist and founder of Stop Police Terror DC and DC's movement for Black Lives Matter. Paul Jay, of course, is with us. He's editor-in-chief here at the Real News Network. And Dr. Khalilah Harris, who's an attorney and an educator and executive producer here at Real News. And good to have you all in the studio.
Thank you.
So let's begin. So we know from the news that the House has been taken by the Democrats. Let's start there. What that means. We saw this blue wave. We'll come to the blue wave issue in a moment. Sometimes there's a trickle, sometimes there's a stream. The wave maybe not have happened, but they are taking the House. So, Thomas Frank, let's start there. So what does it really mean that they're taking the House? I mean, because it also looks as if a lot of the progressive candidates that people thought were going to win did not win. Mm-hmm. But the Democrats still took the House.
Well, look, the important thing is that there's a check on President Trump. That's the critical thing, okay? Because now the Democrats will control committees. That means they have subpoena power. That means that he can't evade them. I mean, for example, you'll see his tax returns now. I mean, those will come out. He won't be able to just ignore, the sort of the oversight of Congress anymore. That's really important. On the other hand, that's the good side. And I'm very pleased about that result, by the way. It was a little, it's been a little scary for me watching this guy as president with basically no congressional oversight, where they'll let him do anything. I mean, we can all rattle off a dozen examples of, that have pissed us off personally. But here's the other side of the coin. Some wave. Right? You talk about wave elections. 2010, by the way, which is a wave that should never have happened. The Republicans took 63 seats. 1994, what they used to call, remember Newt Gingrich, the Republican Revolution, they called it. They took 54 seats. In 74, which was the Whitewater, I'm so old. The Watergate.
Watergate. I remember Watergate. Watergate. Yes, Watergate.
The Democrats took 49 seats. You go back to 1938, the Republicans took 81 that year and still didn't get control because the Democrats still had such a towering majority that it wasn't enough. But this is not of that. This is not on the same scale. And for all of you, think about where we are historically. Okay, you've got history on the Democrat side this time around. They've got money. By the way, this is something we need to
way
talk
outspent the Republicans.
I've never seen that before. That the Democrats outraised the Republicans in a mid-year or in a midterm election. They've got. I've never seen the media so united behind the Democrats, or certain factions of the Democrats, I should say. And this is it. This is what they get. The Republicans still control the Senate. So let me say, I feel like it should have gone farther.
So Jacqueline, let me let you jump in there. So what do you expect then from this movement where the Democrats take the House? What do you expect to happen?
Tax returns. That's pretty much it. Tax returns and subpoenas of Trump, more investigation into his family's financial dealings. That's what they're going to do as far as stopping Trump is concerned. But legislating policy for people that they're supposed to represent, we're going to see more of nothing. And that was the problem with the Democrats. That's why this wasn't a blue wave, because they did not campaign on policies for people. They didn't address issues that people are dealing with. They campaigned on stopping Trump. And that's pretty much what we're going to get, sort of, at least until 2020.
Paul?
Well, I think there's going to be a fight in the Democratic Party, especially maybe not as much in the House, but certainly the fight that's going on outside in the party between the progressive wing and what people call corporate Democrats. The Dems can use the House clearly to investigate. They have committees. They can force the media to watch to cover these things. It's going to be a good drama. They certainly have most of the media already on board for attacking Trump because it's driving ratings. So other than Fox, they'll have MSNBC and CNN will get all over the hearings. But what are they going to use the hearings for? If the hearings are just to trash Trump, and I'm not suggesting the Democrats in their interest, and the truth is they should have those kinds of corruption investigations and so on. But they could use the hearings to have a hearing on what's the best solution for health care. Have a hearing on how do you end mass incarceration. Have a hearing on what's the real solution to the opioid crisis. Most importantly, have hearings on climate crisis. Like, use the hearings to change the public discourse to what's actually important and not just the secondary crap they've been doing. Because here's the evidence. They've been trashing Trump, and look at the results. Where's the blue wave? After CNN, MSNBC, and much of the print press have been playing along with this, the Mueller stuff, the Russia stuff, not focusing on substantive policy stuff, they don't get their blue wave. And I think to a large extent they don't get it because they're not giving a vision for the future. So if they use the House for that, maybe that amounts to something. But that's going to be a fight because the tendency of the corporate Democrats is not to go there, because a real vision for the future doesn't play to the billionaire class that helps control the Democratic Party.
Eugene.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of different issues here. And first and foremost, one thing that I think is relevant about this is it really reflects the bottom falling out of the Democratic Party during the Obama administration, the loss of so many state houses, because the impact of gerrymandering, voter suppression, I mean, really going back to the year 2000, this is a big issue in Florida, obviously coming up here. I mean, so many of these different districts, when you look at a place like Virginia 5, that's my home district, which everyone said, oh, this is definitely one that the Democrats are going to take. They got crushed there. And so many of these districts are drawn in such weird, strange ways to make the sort of come from behind factor so significant that I think, especially for voters of color, that's going to be a huge conversation going into, I think, the rest of this week is, has the Democratic Party done enough to respect the black vote, the Latino vote, especially at the state level in many of these red states where essentially they gave up the game, gave the ball away for years, essentially just walked out. I mean, you look at a situation like the Senate race in Mississippi tonight, which could go the Democrats' way, at least for Mike Espy's piece. They barely even have a Democratic Party in a state like Mississippi. Same thing with Alabama. Even though Doug Jones won, there was really no centralized campaign. It was a surge of individuals. So I think that's going to be a huge question about the role of the Democrats. But I certainly agree that the Democrats have no narrative. I mean, in some of the places they win, they are relying on an anti-Trump politic. In a handful of places, some progressive candidates were able to, become to gain the ballot line because of progressive movements in that area that helped them. But by and large, and Nancy Pelosi actually said this issue going into it, that we have no plan and we're telling the candidates to just run whatever race they can. One thing I would just put in here that I think is very interesting. I suspect that even though they aren't talking a lot about it, that Trump and the Democrats will start to work together on two main issues. Infrastructure, which is already both sides have signaled to each other that they want to do that, and also prescription drug prices, where there's also been some signaling already across the aisle. Those are big things that Trump ran on. And if he's thinking towards 2020, that's a big thing. That would be big wins for him to be able to come with things that people really care about, that are in many ways progressive wins, that are also things that he campaigned on, which would help him in 2020. It doesn't do much for the Republicans as a brand, but it certainly helps President Trump. And I think that'll be an interesting conversation among Democrats. Do you obstruct Trump, or do you work with him to get some of the things that you claim that you want, and that certainly many people in your base do as well?
Khalilah.
I think what everyone said has been important. I want to go back to the point you were just making, Eugene, about gerrymandering, and that how important it is for the House to have flipped Democratic, right? I don't want to let that point go by, because in order to remediate some of what you said about the losses during the Obama administration is going to be critical for some of those lines to be redrawn, and that would not have happened if the House remained red, right? The other piece is the distinction within the Democratic Party around progressives versus the establishment, right? And we saw a lot of candidates who were running their own races, but really pushing against that establishment. If we look at Maryland with Ben Jealous running and not having the establishment come down for him and really dig into it and support his candidacy, that sends a message to people, right? And so the question of who people of color are looking to provide leadership, and frankly, many people of color saying, while there may not be a Blexit, there will definitely be a push on the Democratic Party to either reform itself or shift to other parties like the Green Party, for example. So I think that's critically important in this race. It's something that deserves to be underscored because all of those individual races are critical for the local context. But when you look at the national landscape, it is going to be important for districts to be redrawn and for the Democratic Party to really support its base in a way that they have not been doing, frankly. So and it shows here without the wave. We got a break.
So there's a lot to cover here. So let me just, so if, as we see in the House, the majority of people who we thought were progressive did not really win in these races, or Democrats took the House. You look at races that people were pushing really hard in the media, especially in Georgia and Florida and Texas. Looks as if none of those are going to come to fruition at this moment. Those very tight in Florida, and we'll see what happens there. They could challenge that race. I'm sure that's going to end up happening. But this says something. This could say a lot to the establishment Democrats who run Congress and run the infrastructure of their party, saying, okay, we still have the power. We don't have to listen to this push from the left. We don't have to listen to this push from communities of color. They didn't win. We still have this. So what does that mean? So what about in that context? I mean, what does that?
I think that's exactly right. By the way, Blexit? I have not heard that term before.
It's not important.
It sounds really interesting.
It's a silly concept of black exit from the Democratic Party that someone that doesn't seem too bright came up with. And so,
how can you say that? That's a fascinating idea.
It's a fascinating idea for sure.
But I think that's Mark here is the Democratic Party, the machinery of the Democratic Party is going to look at the results tonight and say, whew, we did it. We delivered. You know, that's
we delivered
done and dusted.
Right. Yeah, but if there's an exit, it's not going to be to the Republican Party, which is why that other concept seems very misguided.
Right. You remember the saying from the 1990s, they have nowhere else to go. And that's they say that all of us sitting around this table here, they've got nowhere else to go, and now they will be able to say that to themselves as they drift off to sleep tonight, and they have fended off any possibility of that happening. And here's what I worry about: is that this is a small chapter in a longer-term story that goes back to the late 60s, early 1970s. You know, the rise of Richard Nixon, our governor of Maryland at his side. Do you remember? God, I'm blanking on his name now.
Spiro Agnew.
Yeah, the man who invented the liberal media bias thing, you know. And this is a story that goes back to then, and that initial backlash against the 1960s. And it is still rolling today. And what I haven't seen, and it gets worse. It gets worse every couple of years. You know, first there was Nixon, then there was Reagan, then there was Bush, and then there was Trump. And in between you had Gingrich, and you have had all of these characters. And we've all seen what they're doing. Where's the plan for putting this whole thing into reverse? Where's the plan for, instead of just being like, okay, we're the not Trump party, or we're the ones that are going to slow Reagan down a little bit. You know, where is the plan for rebuilding a real, genuine?
Well, let me take that notion from a different angle here and see what. So if you are right now, the difference between now and let's say 1968, or 70 or 72, is that most of the radical activists were working through the Democratic Party and running in these elections. A lot of them lost. Everybody got all excited because Ocasio-Cortez won. You know, that was going to be a wave that didn't happen. So what does that mean for all the activists inside the Democratic Party, Eugene, that were pushing all this, and now they're not quite on the inside? If they had been on the inside and won, they'd have a different push inside that party. But we're looking at something very different here.
Well, I think this is the challenge of sort of using this Democratic road to power, or solely Democratic road to power philosophy. I think that you trap yourself in a situation that if you don't get the short-term wins, everything blows back against you. The establishment, the money, the consultants, all the people who were looking, with a little bit of egg on their face, especially after 2016, are now able to sort of re-solidify their message. And there's a certain disingenuousness to it because many of their candidates also did not do very well. I'm sure if we look at the DCCC red to blue list, as we go throughout the week in some of these races that will take time because of absentee ballots. I'm sure we will see many of those people not really succeed. So I think that there's a logical fallacy there, but I think that it speaks to the reality of the Democratic Party as an institution, which is, I think the Republicans have a huge advantage in politics. No matter how far to the right you go, if I'm a major corporate donor, even if I think the Tea Party is too disruptive or whatever, they're still basically saying zero regulation, zero taxes, you're going to make a ton of money, everything's going to be fine. On the Democratic side, the further you go to the left, the more the people who pay for things. So you're looking at a complete and total overhaul of the way a party is structured. You're looking at billions of dollars of sort of corporate lawyer media buying complexes that would be totally out of business if the Democratic Party was to make this shift. And I think people should ask themselves not whether you can win isolated elections as a Democrat, which I think the answer is 100% true, but can you transform a party in and of itself? I'm skeptical of that, and I think that this to some degree speaks to that because you look at a candidate like a Kara Eastman, no real support from the Democrats. Jess King, who got some support right there towards the end. I mean, they went out of their way. Ben Jealous, the Maryland establishment, basically openly abandoned him from day one. To the point that he
in Massachusetts,
right? He didn't go to their yearly beach party, and they said he was the worst candidate they ever had.
So we just got news in that it looks as if Gillum lost and DeSantis won in Florida. Abrams seems to be behind in Georgia. Ben Jealous lost here in the state of Maryland from where we're broadcasting. So let's talk a bit about that for a moment. And a better loss apparently in Texas, and so this has a lot to do with the South.
Yes.
And especially in the black vote and black candidates. So let's talk a bit about what that means too, because this also has an effect on what Democrats may or may not do and what they may or may not push, given those losses. Paul, you want to say something? Jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to just back up a step. I don't think we should talk about the Democratic Party as just like this thing in itself. It's a class alliance, as the Republican Party is. You have a billionaire class that control most of the party machinery. You have an alliance with trade unions who kind of, to a large extent, play ball with Wall Street, but they also represent workers. You have a whole section of the urban population that's quite sophisticated, wants progressive legislation. So the party's a whole bunch of warring factions. This is the problem with people talk too much about the Democratic Party as if it's an ideological struggle. It's a struggle of interest. There's different classes, there's different people want different things out of this political process. I personally think that right now we are in the heartland of the empire. Let's be realistic about what's possible in this country, which with fabulous riches to throw at, stimulate the economy. Like that, they come up with $700 billion for the military, but they also come up with $450 billion or something for domestic spending. They can throw money at the situation, they don't even feel it. And all of a sudden, no one cares about the debt anymore. So what's realistic? Given the state of politics in the country, a war in the Democratic Party by people with progressive values right now is the only thing with momentum. Can you transform the Democratic Party? No, because it's practically, not practically, it essentially is the arm of the state. It's like, can you transform the FBI? No. Right. But if you had a progressive fight in the FBI, I think it's a good thing. Can you transform the Army? No. But can you have a progressive fight amongst soldiers who don't want to go off to a war? So we got to be realistic about what's possible here. And this fight in the Democratic Party, and let's just add, this whole thing's about 2020. Everything, they can't change any legislation in the House. They're not going to get passed by the Senate. Trump isn't going to sign anything. So it comes down to what's the propaganda value of taking the House, and it's going to be part of a wider fight. There's a civil war that's going to start tomorrow in the Democratic Party, and we'll see, because the danger is if the corporate Democrats do win in 2020, and it's hard to believe, although after seeing tonight, who the hell knows what's going to happen. The problem is that if this progressive fight doesn't unfold in a big, broad way, then even if the corporate Dems win in 2020, look out for the next one, because the next Trump ain't going to be a clown.
Well, there's a lot here to jump into. I want to get to that, because one of the factors in this race had to do with looking at Trump and the people in the Republican Party as this right-wing, racist, nationalist group that was seizing political power in this country, which is what was supposed to have united people to come into this fight. So, but I want to come to that because I think it's really critical, because that defines a lot about what this battle is going to be in America in the next several years. But before we do that, joining us right now by phone is Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, good to have you. Oh, okay, sorry, I thought it was coming up. He's not there yet. So let's jump into this. So I mean, that was the argument people used about why you should unite with the Democrats in this race, was because of the danger of this right-wing, racist, nationalist coup in America, which is not far-fetched.
No, not at all.
Right.
So how does that play into this? I mean, Jacqueline.
This is, it seemed to me to be almost like a disingenuous argument from the Democratic Party, and I don't want to. What we never do too much of in Luke Ma Nation is focus so much on the Republican Party, because they're obvious, right? I mean,
it's too easy.
Yeah, it's like there's nothing to figure out with what's wrong with the Republican Party. They're very open about their whatever it is, their racism. They're very open about their sexism. They're very open about their xenophobia, and they're not ashamed of it. So why are we wasting time talking about what's wrong with them? We know what's wrong with them. The problem is that we have not focused on how the Democratic Party has been complicit in advancing some of those narratives in some of their policies. I mean, we're talking about a Democratic Party that used to be the party of the working class and supporting labor unions and supporting women and gays and black people, but all of a sudden, in formulating this third way kind of neoliberalism, they abandoned what they called identity politics, which really is just legislating for the relief of oppressed people, of specific groups of people who are oppressed. And they started focusing on attracting the votes of middle class, moderate Republican white men. So their message became middle class, moderate, Republican, white kind of ideology. What is important to those people? And in doing that during the Clinton administration, because that's where third way Democratic policies came from, that's how he won the White House, from appealing to middle America.
Maybe. It wasn't that he was the first black president?
Last time I checked, that's not quite how that works. I mean, look, we come in all kinds of shades. That was a different one. That was a shot.
So I couldn't resist. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, if playing saxophone badly on Arsenio Hall with shades on qualifies you as black, then wow, we've got a larger population than we think we do. Mm-hmm. But I mean, so the Democratic Party truly has abandoned its base, not only in the current election cycle, but going all the way back to, and it actually started before
I'd like to push back
Clinton.
On that.
Okay.
Because I don't think the Democratic Party ever was the party of working people. And I don't think it ever was.
That's a good argument.
I think Roosevelt and the New Deal was an anomaly. True. Caused by deep, deep crisis. Mm-hmm. And from Truman on, Democrats and Republicans have been undoing the New Deal.
That's true.
And
oh, come on, be nice to Harry Truman.
He was the man of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
No, I know, but the New Deal, he kept pressing for that. He wanted national health care. You know, he was the first one to press on civil rights. That was good.
No, he was worried that Henry Wallace was going to become the president.
That's right, exactly. And Wallace believed in it even more.
Speaks to the role of third parties.
Truman is there to overthrow Wallace. So, I mean, in the context, you're starting at the height of the New Deal. You don't just undo the whole thing right away and keep your support within the Democratic Party.
And also, when we're talking about the New Deal,
I'm sorry that I got you guys off the track.
No, it's okay. But when we're talking about the New Deal, now that you bring that up, since we're talking about the abandoning of people of color, of voters, of poor people by the Democratic Party, even the New Deal excluded some of those very people. So the very party that's supposed to be for the downtrodden and the oppressed pretty much left the downtrodden and the oppressed behind.
One quick point. It's not about I don't think it's about the Democratic Party being evil or bad or this or that. There's a much bigger picture here. which is financialization of the economy, starting in the beginning of the 20th century. Really, the banking sector takes off. There's a dip during the crisis. There's a dip during World War II. But from World War II on, the percentage of GDP that's financed takes off like a rocket ship. That power of finance, the power of Wall Street, is controlling both parties. For a while, the United States is cleaning up after World War II, has so much riches, they're even willing to share it with the upper stratum of the working class. Then you get globalization, and they say, well, screw you, we can produce in China. So all you unions and all you upper stratum of the workers, ciao. And now we're where we are. What I'm getting at is it's not just some change of mind of the Democrats. There's a real process going in within the system.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and I agree with that. But I also see that even in when we're talking about globalization and the financialization of both parties, especially the corporate focus of the Democratic Party, there is still a reality that's facing the bottom half, the bottom section of this society, that blacks and Latinos will have zero wealth in 2053. Zero. I mean, zero. So, and we have a political party. We don't expect the Republicans to do anything about that. But if we're talking about a political party that's been telling us that we have to vote for this party to stop the damage of the other party, then why isn't this party stopping this damage that's been happening to us all this time?
So let me, I'm going to intercede here for a moment. So I want to come back to this. I think it's really important. But I want to bring our other guest in here, just joining us by phone, is Ralph Nader. Ralph, good to have you with us. How are you?
Very good, thank you. The Democrats almost blew it again. They're going to probably win the House, but they should have landslided this corrupt, cruel, vicious, openly anti-people, anti-patient, anti-environment, anti-worker party called the Republican Party. And when are we going to learn that it comes down to voter turnout in neighborhood after neighborhood? Half the people stayed home, even though it was a higher turnout than 2014. So the close races where black candidates lost in Georgia and Florida, they never would have been competitive a few years ago. Why did they become competitive? Because of voter organization and turnout. The areas where the people won in Arkansas on minimum wage, or the ex-felon enfranchisement initiative, over 60% won in Florida, is because of voter turnout. You know, we can talk about the oppressors, and we have to. We can talk about Trump, and we have to. We can talk about the corporate giant takeover of our governments from Washington to state capitals. We can talk about the ripoffs and the fraud and the crime. But we have to talk about organizing movements in every congressional district, and starting with the Congress. The Congress is our most powerful tool. It's the smallest branch, the most powerful by far under our Constitution. War declaration, appropriations, on, is in Congress, the taxing power. And there are only 535 of them. And we know their names. And one thing they want more than money from special interests, commercial interests, is our votes. And we've got to get over this over-concentration on discriminatory injustice at the expense of indiscriminate injustice. That is, where everybody is being ripped off, regardless of their gender or racial or cultural or whatever identity. We have to focus on the discrimination deep, from corporate prisons to mass incarceration to the kind of public facility destruction that happens to be in poor areas of the city, and lack of health care and all that. But we have to mobilize where everyone is ripped off. You know, I've talked to conservative Southern audiences on consumer protection being ripped off, hospital malpractice, credit fraud, all the rest. They're all ripped off the same way. Conservatives and liberals, self-styled voters, are ripped off the same way. So the major redirections that we can win soon are living wage, That's a left-right support among workers. You think conservative workers in Walmart don't want a better wage? The second is full Medicare for all. The third is dealing with $1.4 trillion of gouging student debt that is aborting their opportunities in life year after year. The fourth is a law enforcement, law and order crackdown on corporate crooks from the ghettos to Wall Street. They're ripping off trillions of dollars of money that people earned. And the other one is a new tax system where revenues can be raised and redirected from the corporate welfare subsidy handout, bailout budgets to rebuild the public works in every community in America. We're not talking just about highways and bridges. We're talking about community health clinics. We're talking about libraries. We're talking about sewage and safe drinking water systems. We're talking about public transit. And in order for this to happen, and you don't think that comes in at 90% back home, those kinds of jobs, good paying jobs that can't be exported to China in every community, in order that for happen, the military budget has to be confronted. There are a lot of retired generals and national security officials who think the military budget is bloated, the Pentagon procurement system is corrupt, that the empire around the world is boomeranging against us. More and more countries, more and more fighters hate us. That's what we're getting for the trillions of dollars. And we got to stop blowing up other countries and building infrastructure here. And that all comes down to Congress. 535 people. If you get an enlightened billionaire for $100 million a year, you can start, jumpstart Congress watchdog groups that represent majority opinion on living wage, on full Medicare for all, on adequate housing and public transit and public infrastructure. And look at that. That's peanuts. There's a near billionaire. His name, you may know him. His name is Nick Hanauer. He's from Seattle, and he writes these wonderful articles lecturing his business colleagues to raise that minimum wage to a living wage. It's now frozen at $7.25 federal. Some states have it higher. And you know what he said the other day? He said in Politico, he said, if the Democratic Party doesn't markedly move left, they will not be where the center is. In other words, there's huge left-right support for major redirection of priorities and investments and public budgets and tax reform in this country. So let's not get away with our legitimate rage at what's happening to our country and its impact in the world and climate disruption, which hits the poor even worse than people who have more money. Let's not get away from the nuts and bolts getting out the vote. When you have half the people who don't vote in this country, we know who they are. They're African Americans, Hispanic Americans, they're poor whites. They feel disempowered, they feel discouraged, they feel excluded, disrespected, underpaid, underinsured. They're desperate, to try to make ends meet. They're deep in debt. 40% of the families in this country, in a study, couldn't handle a sudden $400 debt that they weren't planning for. And that's the coalition that's going to win control of the Congress. Now, you win control of the Congress, and then things change at the executive level. Different kind of judges are confirmed or not confirmed. It affects the state legislatures. 530 men and women. Huh? Don't you think we outnumber them? Don't you think there are a lot of conservative and liberal voters who want the same things for their children? Good schools, good public services, fair taxation, clean air, clean water, safe medicine, safe food, and the end to this televised corporate pornography that sidesteps parental authority, whether they're liberal or conservative, and directly markets to 8, 9, 10-year-olds junk food, junk drink, and unbelievable violent programming. You don't think that's a left-right support thing? These corporations are raising our kids. They're undermining parental authority and morality. They are electronic child molesters. The Democrats have lost one issue after another. They're trying to defeat today the Republican Party with a hand and two fingers tied behind their back because they're completely indentured to their commercial funders. And that's why they didn't make an emblazoned issue of living wage, which comes in 70-80%. That's why they didn't make a major issue of full Medicare for all. They didn't even talk about the public option. That's why they didn't make a major issue of cracking down on the corporate crime wave that goes into every neighborhood and its baleful impacts, redlining, loan sharks, rent-to-own rackets, payday loan rackets. That's why they didn't make an issue of the public corruption of the Trump administration and how Trump is taking the federal cops off the corporate crime beat, from the coal industry to the oil industry, banking to insurance. Again and again, they are losing the winning issues because they don't put them up for the voters.
Okay, Ralph, now hold it just one second. I want to introduce another guest who just came in. I was here, Dr. Lester Spence, Professor of Political Science and Africana Studies at Hopkins University. His latest book, Knocking the Hustle Against the Neoliberal Turn of Black Politics. Good to have you in the studio. Good to see you once again.
Yeah, good to be here.
You can jump in with your thoughts.
So one of the things that I don't think we paid much or enough attention to are the various ballot initiatives, right? So we can think about the Democratic Party and the degree to which they're representing people's interests or black people's interests or poor folks' interests. And that's important to talk about, whether we talk about that in general or within that neoliberal term period, or whether we talk about it in relationship to how many seats they should have won, right? But what we need to be focusing on, both in the short term and the long term, are these various ballot initiatives for two reasons. One is because we know that ballot initiatives draw people to the polls, right? And particularly during off-year elections, when we actually need people to come to the polls more than normal, having the right ballot initiatives on the proposal, on the ballot is a good look, right? Secondarily, it actually increases people's capacity to govern, right? And it actually increases our ability to actually have a functioning democracy. So if you look at Michigan, where Michigan just passed a ballot initiative that actually allows for, I'm sorry, I have stuff in my ear. That allows for.
Yeah, there you go.
Like, so when you actually have something in the ballot that actually reduces gerrymandering, and gerrymandering has been killing the ability of the Democratic Party to function, of people to actually get their needs met. If you think about Michigan, where they actually just passed legislation, it looks like they're going to pass legislation to allow for marijuana. Now, to be for real, it's not like that's really my thing. But that actually extends the ability of people to actually live lives without having to worry about the law coming after them. If you think about that Florida ballot initiative, where for the first time, if the number is, I saw the number, I don't think it's right, but it's crazy if it is, like 40% of black men in Florida are not going to have the ability to vote. Right?
Why?
So as we're thinking about
what happened to them?
The felon disenfranchisement. 1.4 million people in the state of Florida.
So real quick, because I've been waiting.
I know, but I want to get, because before Thomas has to leave, I want to get over the.
No, that's okay. Keep going.
Yeah, so if you think about that, so the Democratic Party is responsive. So, Paul, you're right. The Democratic Party has got is significantly constrained by capital, by a certain type of capital. But at the bottom line is, at some point in time, they're going to have to actually get votes. And the more we expand democracy, the more they're going to have to respond to that.
They don't like democracy.
No, hell no.
No. I think what you just said was really critically important. And before we turn to Danny Glover, who's going to be joining us in a couple of minutes here, I know Thomas Frank has to leave soon. I wanted to get you back in here.
I have to go in about 15 minutes.
So I wanted to let you jump back in, especially respond to what Lester just said, because I think there's a complex question here about all that we really should delve into together, because it has to do with the future of where our politics are going.
What you just described one way of, forgive me for a second here. I grew up in Kansas, We had this chapter in Kansas history called populism. They had it in a lot of southern states too, where left-wingers took over the state government.
Yeah, that's right.
And one of the things they believed in is what you just described, initiative and referendum. And what you also described, you know, the mass disenfranchisement of people. And there's all sorts of different ways that they have of doing this now. It's not blatant and, you know, in your face like it was in the 1890s and 1900s. It's, you know, a little slightly more settled. It's voter ID laws. It's, you know, all of these different things. That's anti-populism, you know. And I've been researching populism. I'm supposed to be writing a book about it. But I came up here today, so I would be at home typing on the book.
Are we supposed to feel guilty
but
now?
here's the thing. Here's the deal. Democrats don't like populism anymore. They look at Trump and they're like, that's populist. We don't want anything to do with that. We want to stay away from that. They have this distorted idea of what populism is, and they think it's this awful man and these awful politicians in Europe like Marine Le Pen and these other people, and it has poisoned the word and the idea for them. And they can't look back into their own tradition now and see, this is what we used to be, folks. You know, and we were, I'm sorry, I should say we, I'm not much of a Democrat. I mean, I am one, right? I vote for the Democrats and everything, but they were the party of the vast, you know, they didn't need the corporate money because they had the people. So they were the party of the people.
You know, if I could just interject something quickly about Florida, which I think is very interesting, the Amendment 4, which did restore the voting rights. By the way, 63%, which means, you know, 15% of DeSantis voters must have done it. For sure, only about a 70,000 vote thing here. But also that this is a campaign that was led by people who were former prisoners. And that is one of the most interesting trends in politics over the past 2 years. We saw Larry Krasner really got over the hump because incarcerated people from Philadelphia and their families. We saw, certainly in Alabama, this was a big issue in the Doug Jones case. And by the way, Kenny Glasgow of the Ordinary People's Society, who registered probably thousands of voters in jails, then subsequently just a couple months later framed up on a murder charge that he's facing right now, which gives you a sense of how potent it is. But you also see it non-electorally with things like the national prison strike. I think this is one of the most interesting trends that we're seeing right now in politics.
Ordinary People's Society?
They call themselves the Ordinary People's Society in Alabama. It's a great community group.
Name.
They register thousands of people. They work with returning citizens. They do so much great work. No surprise why their leader is being targeted in a state like Alabama. It's a wild story for people to look into it. But I think it's very interesting to see that where we're going in the conversation around mass incarceration, especially, that it's not just sort of prisoners as objects of the discussion, but inside of prisons organizing their friends and their family on the outside to make a huge political difference.
I have to interject something here. I was just in Australia and I was meeting with all these Labour Party politicians, and one of them was telling me this anecdote. And he's like, "Well, I was canvassing in a prison one time," and I'm like, "What?"
Well, yeah, right, because they have the vote.
Right.
They have to go campaign in prisons.
Yes. And this is the kind of grassroots action that happens on the state level, on the local level, inside the Democratic Party, people who are having to do this because, of course, they don't want to run as Republicans. And in a lot of places, they can't get any traction as a third-party candidate, so they have to run as a Democrat. So they do this kind of grassroots local organizing inside the Democratic Party, and they win. And then the National Democratic Party ignores them. And that's why that's one of the reasons why there's no blue wave. It's just a trickle. It was just a trickle because the National Democratic Party actually ignores the will of the people on the ground at the local level in the states.
So let me just come in here. We just had Ralph Nader, who is the founder of the Center for Study of Responsive Law, and his latest book was To the Ramparts. I want to thank Ralph for joining us. The Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for Trump. We're now joined by Danny Glover, actor and activist. Danny, good to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Well, always great to have you with us. So you've heard some of the conversation, I take it, so I want to kind of leap in here with a question for you, knowing you just got back to the country, but you know, you're very aware of what's going on around us. One of the things, there's a subtext here of some of the conversations we've been having around this panel. And part of that subtext has to do with both class and race. Thomas Frank raised the issue of populism in this country. The populist movements that have taken place. One of the things that killed populist movements was race in this country and racism. We're seeing this rise of racists taking power all over the country, especially through Trump and certain members of the Republican Party. So I want to hear your analysis of where you think that takes us. Where are we?
The whole idea of populism you can go all the way back to the Bacon Rebellion in 1679, where blacks and indigenous servants, poor white landless workers, people got together and had a rebellion. And that was a populist rebellion. We think about the Eugene Debs running for president in 1918 from prison. And we think about the populist movements, which you don't talk about at the end of the 19th century as well. So the idea that it's tradition, is part of the tradition of this country, and this sense of its own radicalism as well. When I think about that now, it's hard to tell, you know, what place we are in. I know not only Americans were looking forward to this election as more came to vote. There were something like 257 women on the ballot, more women on the ballot than ever before. You had people of Muslim descent on the ballot. You had people who were Palestinian on the ballot. You had this extraordinary moment right now, and I think there has to be right now a feeling of some sense of disappointment at the outcome as we look at the outcome now. Now, this is not only, I think, important for us to understand domestically and everything else, but imagine what impact the election had on the people of Latin America, who just saw a fascist become the president of Brazil, in Bolsonaro. Or think about what is happening in Venezuela, where the attack on Venezuela, as well as Cuba, as well as Nicaragua, more sanctions on this. So you would hope that whatever we did here would in some at least halt the move to fascism, or move to the right. Let me use not fascism, but to right, would in some sense, what we do here would embolden, if we had done dramatically well, would embolden the people who are in those countries in Latin America and other places in the world who are waiting to see what we do. I mean, the world is waiting to see what we do. And to some extent, for whatever reason, whether it was the conflicts inside of the Democratic Party and the struggle to who's going to control the party, or the centrists going to control the party, or the populists, or the young progressives who are going to control the party, who move somewhat marginally to the left or whatever. But I think we have some real questions to ask ourselves right now, because it was important to get the House back. If we hadn't got the House back, that'd have been really drastic, dramatically ugly. But it's important to get the House back, even by the slim margins that we have. But mind you, there's still the issues on the table about war, still the issues on the table about climate change. Is the Democratic Congress now going to change that narrative and that conversation about those particular things? Those still is issues that are right there and in front of us.
So one of the things that just came over the transom here that I think is important to talk about, because it talks about what the divide means, the complexities of how things, the intersection of what happens, race, class, and also how we view the world socially, right? So there was a referendum in West Virginia. The referendum in West Virginia, the state constitution, they passed it, 51.6% said yes, that the state constitution is amended to say that women's right to abortion is not protected in West Virginia, which leads the way for the West Virginia legislature to pass a law banning abortions in West Virginia. So America is a complex place when it comes to our politics, because we're one of the most heterogeneous nations on the planet Earth, and all the complex history that we have in this country. So this law is paving the way for something very dangerous that could happen to women in this country, passing West Virginia, being pushed by Trump and pushed by the Senate. So I mean, so again, this adds another element to how we analyze what this election means and where this might take us.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a major element, and I think this is, I mean, you know, the whole reason you pass something like this is to get it to the Supreme Court, to get them to consider the question.
Right.
It's the same thing we're seeing with all these fetal heartbeat bills, and really the entire strategy over the past few years of the anti-abortion rights movement is either to try to kill it outright, obviously, by sending a case like West Virginia, or I think equally as ominous, even though it's less talked about, defining down the issue and sort of the time of the viability of the fetus to make abortion effectively illegal in so many different places. And I think it's part of a complex legal strategy we've seen that the Republicans have engaged in, or the anti-abortion movement really, for the past 5 or 6 years. And it's really starting to bear fruit here, I think, with not only the ascension of all these different judges, but I think what we've seen at the state legislature level, which again, to go back to the gerrymandering issue, I think we have to actually consider the fact that huge swaths of the country were just given up by the Democrats. The progressive people there, all the people there, we can never reach them, we can never talk to them, it makes no sense at all. And this is, you know, part, I mean, it's not what you get per se, but it's a big part of what you get when you look at that kind of strategy over the...
Or when, another way of saying it, when your movement dies. West Virginia was not just a democratic state when I was a child, but a profoundly democratic state. And now it's, you know, went for Trump by some enormous percentage. It is, and it's because why was West Virginia a democratic state? Because of organized labor, because those people were, you know, it's a working class state, it's a poor state, and that this should happen to them. It's just it's so shocking, and it's a microcosm of what has happened to the Democratic Party in so many ways. But hey, they won Orange County. You know? They won. They're doing well in Johnson County, the county in Kansas where I grew up. But yeah, it's astonishing.
Well, the racial demographics are changing. Racial demographics are changing in Orange County. They're not the Orange County that we thought about during the Reagan terms and Reagan years. It looks different than it did then. And so I think you have to take that in consideration too. How much of that is being because of the mobilization that the Democratic Party did, or whether people were dealing with right across, not far from their borders, the issue of immigration, and maybe that had an impact on that what happened as well. But California is at the same time is an unusual state itself, as we all know. I mean, even now the discussion right here, and I don't know the outcome of the election with Javanka Beckles, who's running for the Assembly District number 15. And what that outcome means, there's a fight between the moderate Democrats and those who are progressive. I mean, and the candidate has none of the qualifications that candidate Beckles has, you know, and yet the centralist Democratic Party put all this weight behind that candidate. And so I think I don't know. I don't think maybe this struggle within the Democratic Party about who's going to control the Democratic Party is one of the key elements that really left us in the situation that we are right now, you know, and where the resources went to and who the resources went to. Now, like I said, it's great that we were able to, the Democratic Party was able to recapture the House. But there were great expectations in that. When you look at Georgia and what happened in Georgia and everything else, and you look at it in relationship to the cleansing of the voting polls, voting rolls, and everything else, and all the other things that had happened, and the racist tactics uses, the racist tactics of fear. You know, fear has been the trump card for Trump himself all along, and he used that, and you can't underestimate the impact that that's had on this what has occurred tonight as well.
Let me just say thank you to Thomas Frank on his way out. Good to have you with us, Thomas. Thank you, glad you could join us.
Yeah. So I actually want to tie the populist dynamic, that first populist moment, to the dynamic in West Virginia. So I think you're absolutely right, but there's something else going on. So we've got these populations. One of the things that's complex about human beings in general, much less Americans, is we all have different identities. I'm a dad, I'm a professor, I'm an African American, I'm a man, et cetera, et cetera. The question is, politically, often it's like, what aspects of those identities can you actually speak to? Can you get people to move on? So one way to read that West Virginia, alongside what Thomas was talking about before he jetted, is that what the right has been able to effectively do time after time at the local, the state, and the national level is get people to think about themselves primarily in cultural terms. Right? So if you think back to that populist moment in the 1890s, there were three dynamics that actually killed the People's Party. One dynamic was concentrated corporate power and they controlled the state. The second dynamic was that whites and blacks just couldn't kind of see, they just couldn't see eye to eye, because whites actually were, and this connects to the third dynamic, whites were able to, elites consistently articulated a message that made whites think of themselves first and foremost as whites in an interclass alliance, as opposed to that other message where they thought about where they could have thought of themselves as being in the same class alongside blacks. So that's the way to read that West Virginia dynamic. And we're going to see that increasingly, whether it's about immigration, whether it's about abortion rights, whether it's about a range of other cultural issues. The question is can some combination of progressive forces articulate a similar set of policies using a similar set of ballot initiatives that can get people to see themselves as something broader than simply being white?
And Danny Glover, before you have to roll, do you want to have a thought here?
I'm sorry?
Before you have to go, do you want to jump in with another thought?
Well, I think when we look at historically, I mean, we're right. We know all the points. We know all the points where the struggles have been struggles that we were able to find common ground. Poor white people and blacks and other minorities were able to find some sort of common ground. But you also, the other elements that we often live in, that what brought people together in the 19th century and maybe the early part of the 20th century are not the dynamics that bring people together in the 21st century, because we have something else, and that is a system that provides some sort of advantage, and that advantage is to be a consumer in that system itself. And I think that, in a sense, more than any place else, has fractured whatever possible relationship we have. We look at the end of World War II and an incredible progressive legislative and that brought African Americans into the labor force, the primary labor force. We look at that, and then we see the expulsion of members of the CIO. Of 1 million members of the CIO in 1949. We see the de-radicalization that had brought about the changes. Radicalization had brought about the changes that we were able to embrace and realize, I'm thinking now, just as myself, 50 years after the strike at San Francisco State, my alma mater, where we're able to struggle, go on strike, and bring about the first school of ethnic studies in any major college in the United States, and yet at the same time, that moment came at a particular moment where we saw rebellion that was happening not only in the United States, but in other places in the world, not only in the public space after King's assassination with revolts, but also on college campuses as well. That kind of radicalism is the kind of radicalism you need, that kind of engagement. Civic engagement as citizens is what we need at this particular point in time.
I know you have to run, but it's always great to have you with us. I really appreciate you taking time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Here. And we just got another announcement that both Sharice David and Deb Haaland won, which means you now have, for the first time in American history, 2 Native American women going to go sit in the U.S. Congress. Mm-hmm. One from Kansas and New Mexico.
Along with 2 Muslim women, too.
And one with 2 new, right, exactly. Yeah, right. They won their elections as well. We may be hearing from Ilhan later with any luck. So let me come back to where we kind of left off with and what Danny just said. I mean, I think that we're looking at the Democrats now who've taken the House. Let's talk for a moment about the thing what Paul just said and everybody else has just said. What does that really mean in terms of the body politic and where this is going to go? I mean, if the Democrats are only going to use their seizing the House to question Trump and sort of investigations around Trump, but not to posit any new ideas, that if you have this huge split in America that is built around race and social ideas, and we cannot put that as a kind of a minor issue. It's one of the major issues that we face in this country that always kills every movement that exists. Where do you think this takes us? Where does it take the House? What do they do?
I mean, I think it's an open question. I mean, I think, and again, I said this earlier, I think something that people may be surprised about, I suspect that you will see Nancy Pelosi and the House leadership immediately try to work with Trump, because the reality is I think the Democrats have already shown they're not going to be completely obstructionist.
So what will that do? Let's say
well, I think it will help Trump win the election in 2020. I mean, I think that the reality is Trump sort of ran as someone who, I mean, he honestly sort of ran as like a center-right independent, right? But in a two-party system, you can't really govern without a party. He was all in on Republicans. He really used the judges to press his partisan advantage with Republicans. But some of his biggest issues aren't Republican issues. But he started to roll them back out. One in this midterm, and I think also looking forward to 2020, prescription drug prices, infrastructure, his biggest campaign promise that he hasn't done anything on yet, trade, where he's already doing some other things. I mean, these are things that are traditionally sort of core things in the Democratic caucus, and I believe very strongly that the leadership there is going to seek to grab it. Now, what that does more broadly, I don't really know. I mean, there will be a subset of Democrats who will be vehemently against that, because they will say that we have to do everything to obstruct Trump, but who will those people be? I think they will tend to be more affluent suburban districts. I think the people who could use the jobs, who would like to have lower, pay on their Medicare Advantage and different things like that, will like to see these things from Democrats. So in a weird way, I actually think that, and I said this before the election, this could actually be the best possible outcome for Trump, which will allow him to burnish his reputation as an independent who can work on both sides, who's fighting for the working man on all these different issues, and he still has the Senate so he can still push the judge issue.
And what he's going to do, Paul,
let
me just throw this to attitude, you can come into this, and then everybody, I want to jump into this. What Trump has said is that he wants infrastructure that is built and controlled by private companies, not federal money. So that, and we'll see if the Democrats can bridge that divide, but he's very clear about that. So, I mean, you were going to say what to that? Paul J.
Complicated.
Yes, it is.
There are some deep splits and fractures in the elites. There is a section of the state. There's a reason why Mueller's been going after Trump. There's a whole section of the elite state apparatus that wants this guy out. There's a section of the traditional neocons that wants this guy out. They can't, as much as they've had to embrace him in the Republican Party, the rest of the elites are really, they love the tax breaks, but they don't trust this guy to lead them into crises. I want to just step back a bit to something Jackie said earlier. The problem for us is there is a real fascization going on here because we are heading into a very dangerous period of human history. And the elites know it, even though they don't want to talk about it. They know climate change is coming. The deniers are BS. They don't really even deny it themselves. It's a political gambit for them. It's a partisan issue to play, but they know crisis is coming. One of the things that barely gets talked about, except at the elite level, is the coming of artificial intelligence and roboticization is going to get rid of millions of jobs in the next 10, 15 years. Millions. At the recent Bilderberg conference, and no, I don't think Bilderberg runs the world, but they are a section of real elite conversation.
And for your viewers, who's Bilderberg?
The people that run the world who come and talk to each other. I just don't think they run the world from the Bilderberg conference. But on the last, it's secret meetings, but the agenda is public. I think point 4 was the future of work, and point 5 or 6 was artificial intelligence. They know this massive unemployment is coming, not being talked about. Big crisis coming. They know that with this financial deregulation and this crazy speculation and the amount of money that's flowed up to this top less than 1 percentile, that all the things that led to the crash of 07, 08, it's coming again. I don't know if it's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. There's a lot of things converging for a very profound crisis. in that profound crisis, who's going to manage the system for them? And I don't, in general, I don't think the elites want an all-out fascist solution, but it's certainly there because these aren't such controllable situations. They've used the destruction of public school system where nobody knows a damn thing about history. They've used the media in a way to sow, Gore Vidal had this line called USA, United States of Amnesia. The people have such an ahistorical view to what's going on. These are all the conditions for fascism. And of course, the role of Clinton and Obama and the corporate Democrats, because inequality got so much worse under them. But we're in this position of having to balance. I personally think the corporate Dems and the Democratic Party in power is better than the overt fascism. What I don't agree with is when you say let's vote for the lesser evil or support the lesser evil, let's never not call them evil. Not that it's good and I don't believe in good and evil, but you know what I mean. Like, we should never create illusions about what the corporate Democrats are. We need to tell working people the whole truth and talk and fight for as progressive a values as possible. But I don't think we can get into the position of saying, it doesn't make any difference whether the Dems take Congress or not. There has to be a fight now to force the Dems in Congress to do something, whatever progressive people, relatively progressive and progressive members of the House are. There has to be a fight here because on this point of collaboration with the Republicans, that is because they still think they can win elections by winning over the center and the center right, instead of mobilizing the millions of people who don't vote and registering and a real overt progressive agenda. So there'll be a fight on that, but I don't think they're going to just go along with Trump because they know that we'll reelect him. And in the final analysis, the Dems really only care about their own power. And they want the White House back.
So I have a question, Mother, but let me just turn to both Lester and Jacqueline here to kind of comment on what you just said and where we are before we hit another subject. Lester, let me start with you and go over to Jacqueline. Mike. Do you have thoughts on where we just left?
Yeah, but so there's a challenge if we talk about politics at such a high scale, right? Where we end up running the risk of demobilizing constituencies, but then B, not really thinking through and taking some type of, I don't want to say credit, but taking some type of, here's another way to think about it. I was here 2 years ago, literally here.
Yeah.
And drinking like cider and shots of Fireball whiskey while we were, I'm sorry, man. I thought you knew about that.
No, I did. I did. It was getting obvious as the evening.
It wasn't hard to tell. It was not hard to tell.
As the evening unfolded, it was rather clear.
This is just water.
This is just water. The cider and Fireball is in the back. I remember how we felt when we left. Right? Even as nobody in that room was a Democrat. Nobody in that room was. But I remember how we felt as we left, as if the world were ending. If somebody would have told us in that moment, as we were looking at the headlines, and then as we left, like, listen, in 2 years, the Democratic Party is actually going to take the House back, and we're going to have 2 Democratic socialists elected to the House. One actually representing my parents in Detroit. Nobody would, I don't think, and that we would have given felons the right to vote again in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Sure.
At the same time, and in fact, that only happens if a sizable number of white Republicans vote for that. Mm-hmm. Who would have believed that?
True.
So yes, we got 22 years left before climate change actually hits, and it's probably going to happen sooner than that. Mm-hmm. right? And yes, financial capital and other sectors of capital have a stranglehold, it seems, on the political system. But it has to be a way to talk about that at the same time as we're acknowledging people power. Right, because that's what really happened. We had someone who aspires to be a fascist, take the state, and he lost. Right, so how do we talk about them both at the same time? Those are my thoughts.
Right. Yeah. And I mean I agree with that, and I hear the arguments for harm mitigation. Right, that we need to focus on as far as voting for the Democratic Party, and that's fine, because of course if you're in a war and you get wounded and your leg gets blown off, well, you would like to stop bleeding so you don't die. So of course you want harm mitigation to happen. But while somebody stops the bleeding, at some point you need to be healed, right? So while we're talking about needing the harm mitigation that we get with the Democrats taking the House, that's harm mitigation. That's important, and we need to celebrate that. We absolutely need to celebrate the grassroots, local, people-powered efforts that did give us 2 Democratic socialists. I didn't even realize that there was another one, and the reenfranchisement of felony voters, which is incredibly important, especially for the Black and Latino population. But at the same time, we have to also focus on coming down from that high level, that 10,000-foot level, to not just focusing in on what happened, like in Georgia. Like, how do you get that kind of people power that was behind that mobilization, that amazing mobilization behind this unlikely candidate in Stacey Abrams, who was up against this man who, honestly, Brian Kemp just really did too much damage for too long to have. And I think this is that what happened in Georgia is an example of the Democratic Party not focusing on the issues that really did negatively affect people, honestly, until it was too late. Because Kemp has been allowed to run roughshod on voter suppression in Georgia for too long.
Which could have played a role in this election.
It absolutely played a role in this election. So yeah, I mean, so while we can celebrate that, yeah, we've done some harm mitigation and on the ground we've done some great things, we also have to focus on, so now what are these people who we've elected to mitigate this harm, what are they going to do to put some legs behind the people who are on the ground doing the work on November 7th, on November 8th, on December 15th? What kind of support are these people going to push for these people in these communities on the ground who still need help, who are still on the battleground, they're still bleeding, their limbs are, I'm sorry for the war, but honestly, I look at this as a war, and especially as a 51-year-old Black woman who is kind of afraid for the kind of society our grandkids are going to have to grow up in, that they're going to have to grow up and fight the same battles that my mother fought, that my grandmother fought. Partially because we live in a very racist society and we won't admit that and we won't deal with it. But also partially because we have one political party that is just really, really weak and spineless on the issues, and they just won't back us up.
So I want to introduce a new guest here in a way to that, because I think that I really want to get to this point that you just finished raising about what we are facing in America now, and where do we go with all of this, and what this election tells us or doesn't tell us. Before I introduce the guest on the way to that, let me just tell you about a couple of races that just popped up on our screen here. In Iowa, Stephen King and Scholten are neck and neck. There's no way they can't tell who's going to win that race at this point. It's that close. 49.2% to 48.3%, just to let you know. And in Virginia, in the 7th district, which is one of those bellwether districts, you have Abigail Spanberger, who won, the former CIA person beating Bratt in that district. Now I want to introduce to our viewers here Abby Martin, who is the creator and host of Empire Files. She also helped found Media Roots News. And Abby, welcome. Good to have you with us back here on The Real News.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you've heard some of this conversation, I take it.
Yes.
So let me let you pick up on some of this. I mean, one of I know it's a little too early to see what the results are in California, the referendums. It's probably going to take a while to know. And we hope we can cover some of that tomorrow in our program tomorrow here at Real News. But I'm curious where again, we're really contemplating where this election takes us. I'm thinking about what Paul just said earlier and other people said, and there's some not disagreements, but some interesting kind of contradictions to really explore around class and race and where we are in America. You've got this, we heard so much during this election from many people saying, we've got to stop this racist right-wing onslaught from taking over the country. And then we saw the results of this election. So the question is, given what just happened, where does that struggle take us at this moment?
Well,
what does it say to you?
Sure. Sure. I think it was a trickle. It wasn't a tsunami and it wasn't a wave. I mean, it was a trickle, and we're lucky to have just that. I think it was not a repudiation of the clear and growing threat of fascism that we're seeing with the Trump administration. I mean, given the tactics and rhetoric and actions on the ground that we've seen in the last 2 years, I'm actually stunned at the lack of turnout. But actually, when you're looking at just the complete abysmal failure when it comes to what is the Democratic Party's platform. I mean, I ask people all the time, what do they actually stand for? Instead of just saying, we're not Trump, we're against him. I mean, the rhetoric is all about identity politics and kind of empty platitudes that isn't really tangible things. I mean, it should be a no-brainer, right? The overwhelming majority of Americans support affordable health care. They support net neutrality. They support affordable housing. But when it comes down to the actual policies here, the Democrats can't pull in voters. And then you're talking about the voter suppression. I mean, the disenfranchisement of tens of millions of people around the country. Where are the Democrats on this? Why is it that we have journalist Greg Palast raising money to try to sue the state governors to try to get these voter purge lists? I mean, where the hell is the Democratic Party helping out on this? I mean, why is it that this passivity is institutionalized and just given and acquiesced to the Republican Party? I mean, we are facing a unique Trump brand fascism. Yeah, he might not have done and said the things that Hitler has done or said, but he's our Hitler, and he could be our Hitler. And the fact that the Democrats are tiptoeing around the word fascism about context and analysis about what's going on, you turn on CNN and MSNBC right now, they're cheering and celebrating as if this is some huge victory. This is not a victory. I mean, they are not capable of actually challenging the growing threat here. And it's very, very disturbing. I mean, the GOP is dismantling democracy as we know it because, of course, they know that they don't have the voters behind these policies when you go across the country and see what people really support. But we see fascism is on trend now, and they're just pulling to their base. Trump has never been more powerful. I don't care that they lost by a fringe margin tonight. Trump is emboldened and has never been more powerful. And it scares me that Democrats are not assessing the reality of where we're at. And it scares me that Republicans have taken the majority of the governorships. We're going to see dramatic gerrymandering and also the greenlighting of these federal judges by Chuck Schumer. I mean, he's already greenlit 30 federal district court judges. So I don't think the Democrats are capable of resisting here, which means, the elections are just a small part, of course, of what's going on in this country. And I don't want to disempower and disenfranchise people even more. Because, of course, we know that change will only happen with the masses in the street pushing this policy. In fact, that's how it's always been. So you just had a great deal for Abby. Let me kind of parse this out and think about other people who have said here on this panel. And think about what Paul, what you were saying earlier in the conversation about the nature of the billionaire class, as you call it, and who runs both parties. Though there is, I think, an ideological split among them, as there is everybody in America. I mean, the people in that ruling class who love the Democratic Party are also people who support abortion rights, and where most of the communities of color are aligned with in this country for all kinds of complex reasons. And we've been talking for months and months and months about what we're facing, this onslaught that's built around Trump and what they could do to the future of our country. You just talked a minute ago, Jacqueline, about your fear about your grandchildren and what they're going to face as young black children growing up in a society that could be worse than better. That we could be facing a combination, as I've been saying a lot, of 1877 when Reconstruction was killed and 1932 when a minority party took over Germany. And marrying these two historical moments and thinking about what that could mean for 2018 and 2020 and 2022. So I'm curious what you all think in the time we have here together. Where does that take us then?
It's not, and I think it's great that the Democrats probably have taken the House and they can, if they actually push some issues and bring issues to the table and actually go after some of the things Trump did, but and can kind of raise the level, the heighten the contradictions, though I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for that. Where does this take us?
I spent some time in Pennsylvania, District 11, where Jess King was running. Very progressive candidate, did not try to run against Trump, ran against Smucker, and mostly ran for progressive values. She didn't win, and she actually lost by a fair amount. But what I saw there, to me, is the beginnings, or maybe it's more than beginnings, the kind of on-the-ground organizing that's going on there, and especially organizing amongst poor and working class whites who vote for Trump, and really trying to reach out and talk to them. And I think so much of the left has abandoned that sector of the population and just left it to Fox and left it to the Republicans. But there, in fact, is a lot of that kind of organizing going on. And maybe it didn't break through and win this time, but this is the beginning of a ramp up for 2020. And the kind of organizing going on in that District 11 and some other parts of Pennsylvania, it's really all a step for the next 2 years. So as much as I've been talking about how the billionaire class controls the parties and such, I don't think they're in total control of the situation. I think people are waking up. I think there is organizing going on. And I agree with what you were saying earlier. But we need to do both. There needs to be the fights over the immediate issues of reform that engage people, but we should not talk to people like they're children. Yeah. You know, we are facing an existential moment in history, and people need to know it. And when I was in District 11 talking to Trump voters after one of these debates, and I started talking about the threat of climate change, and I was talking about AI and robotize, I can't even say it now. Robotics and so on. They were very engaged in that because it's not a partisan conversation. And it really does affect us all. So this next 2 years is decisive.
Well, I think that's a very good point. And I think to sort of maybe marry two threads here, one race that kind of indicates a lot of this, sort of one, the inability to learn the lessons of 2016, and two, the inability to embrace mass movements, is the Ohio governor's race, which has now been called for the Republican Mike DeWine. Richard Cordray parachuted in there, defeated Dennis Kucinich at really the sort of behest of the establishment in the state of Ohio. But you look at Ohio, that did go for Trump. It had a lot of sort of Obama 2012, Trump 2016 voters, strong labor movement, different pieces like that. What are some of the main trends there? Trade issues, obviously, something that Kucinich had been out there for years talking about. The issues of the wars, which there's at least one study that looked at Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio and found that many of the most pro-Trump districts had outsized proportions of people who had been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan and other things that had gone on out there. To a second degree was an issue that Kucinich was trying to raise in a major way, which was the gun control issue, which not only was a major movement, but he was trying to really sort of, especially with his lieutenant governor candidate, Tara Samples, really not just have the traditional conversation about gun control, but talk about community violence in black communities and what that really would have meant. And so not only talking about sort of playing into some of the major trends around working class people, but also talking about how do you start to create these alliances between different sectors of working class people on issues that matter to them. And I think at the end of the race, you can really see the problem that you have with that when you have the steel workers vote for the first time, 96% of them to potentially go on strike nationally. Don't know if that's going to happen, but it's a major issue here that to have someone who is a long-time union supporter, known by union members, who could have turned their campaign into a movement campaign. I mean, think about talking about having a card check, right to work type of piece, empowering workers with the bully pulpit of the governor's mansion there in Columbus. In a time like this, when workers are hurting, when workers are fighting, embracing the mass movements that are existing, talking about how I married them and put together. That's the opposite of what the Democrats had. They had this random guy, Richard Cordray. No one's ever heard of him. He's a wonk. He's a terrible speaker. He doesn't even really know that much of the issues. He barely even spoke to workers' issues in a state like Ohio, which is shocking to me, I think, except for maybe the one or two times he showed up at a steelworkers hall. And this is what you get in a situation like this, where Sherrod Brown easily cruises to re-election with that kind of agenda that I'm talking about, one that really is speaking to so many of the concerns of working class people of all races in Ohio. And then you have the governorship go to the Republicans because you do the exact opposite. So I think it's an interesting race to sort of look at some of these larger trends.
Lester, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the points she brought up was the idea of what's going on with the states with the governors. It's important to note that the Republicans actually lost 4 governorships. It's also important to note that if you look at other states, New York, for the first time in a generation, the Democratic Party actually controls both the governor and both seats of the legislature, right? So again, if we can actually articulate Trump as being this larger-than-life figure and Trumpism as a thing, and he is. But again, I go back to 2016. Did any of us sitting here actually imagine that would happen? Did any of us would imagine that New York would actually take all? It's the first time in a generation that that's ever happened, right? Mm-hmm. You know, what's going to happen in Michigan? So Michigan has a Democratic governor for the first time as a result of them passing the anti-gerrymandering ballot. It's likely that their legislature, which has been dominated by Republicans, not just by Republicans, by conservative Republicans, that they'll actually flip, right? So I think what we have an opportunity, what we should be doing, again, going back to that populist example, is thinking about what are these individual institutions at the state level that are working in some cases with Democratic Party, in a lot of cases, to be fair, either against the Democratic Party or at the least in a context where the Democratic Party ignores them. What are the institutions? So if we think about an institution like Florida, we can't think about Gillum's victory. I'm sorry.
Loss.
There we go. Well, I think about him getting all those votes as a victory. Although he didn't win.
Oh, yeah, I hear
but
that.
You can't think of,
right.
I mean,
right.
How does FAMU play a role? Like, what are these black colleges? Mm-hmm. How do these black colleges actually play a role in how Gillum was able to do in Florida, how Abrams was able to do in Georgia, right? How are the churches? I'm a heathen, but how are these churches able to mobilize folk? Right, it's funny. Yeah. I was at the grocery store and I was like, oh my God, oh hell, honey's on sale. And the sister who gave me the honey, she was like, you're not supposed to say hell. I was like, damn, I felt all chastised.
I'm a Christian. I say hell.
Yeah, I said, how do you think it's a word?
So Abby, let me jump in here.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't want to discount, obviously, the very important win, right, to stave off kind of this impending fascist threat from the GOP and these anti-science evangelicals. That is obviously very, very important. But I am worried that the duopoly is going to crush us because I'm worried, for instance, the fact that Nancy Pelosi, 15 years ago was saying impeachment was off the table for George W. Bush. Here she is again saying impeachment's off the table for not only Kavanaugh, but Trump. And her main priority, if they take back the House, is actually going after his tax returns. So I'm just extremely worried about the consultant and big donor class that is controlling the Democratic Party and preventing the ouster or undermining this kind of corporate seizure and capturing from insurgent candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm worried about that. And I'm worried about the fact that there's candidate suppression here. Because again, I just don't think the Democrats are capable of really dealing with this. They're talking about returning to civility. They're not really addressing what the threat really is. And then you look at California, we actually do know the results right now. I mean, California was another state that implemented some bizarre jungle primary system where actually Green Party candidates, peace and freedom candidates were expelled, were purged from the ballot entirely. There was only 3 third-party candidates that even had an option to be on the general election ballot. So I think that when we're looking at California, the results that have come in are, I'm shocked and disappointed, but at the same time, when you look at kind of the nature of the state, we have a huge defense contractor industry. We have giant oil money pouring in. We have the Silicon Valley, of course. So it's hard to penetrate that kind of corporate capture of the state. And that's why you see Feinstein winning, even if the Democrats even abandoned her. I mean, it's just stunning that Feinstein won another term here. We had Prop 10, which was the ability to have affordable housing get knocked down overwhelmingly. It was a very confusing ballot measure that was funded tens of millions of dollars by Trump's friends, corporate landlords and real estate firms. The manager of the biggest donor against Prop 10 was actually a vigilante anti-homeless crusader, and that overwhelmingly got rejected. The public bank option, which could have divested LA from Wall Street, got overwhelmingly rejected. So I think that, again, we're talking about the problem with, corporate capture of our entire country, from politicians down to the media, where these messaging from these ballot propositions are so confusing that people are really consistently voting against their own interests because they're not getting the accurate information, which really a real democracy thrives on.
So there are a couple of results you were just talking, Abby, and I just want to share this with our viewers here, because you were talking about California. Dianne Feinstein looks like she won, obviously, but with 53% of the vote to 46 for Kevin DeLeon, which says a lot. I mean, that's a major kind of push from the left against Dianne Feinstein. And Prop 6, which was a gas tax repeal, yes, it was only 44%, 55%. Killed it, which is a significant as well.
Yeah, it's huge.
And the affordable housing, it was a 40% yes and a 6% no. But these are kind of interesting kind of pieces when you also look at the closeness, the level of difference in the races where people lost, whether it was Gilliam's loss in Florida or the other losses that were very tight.
Well, the Texas one's interesting because while Cruz won by a small amount,
right,
apparently there's like 10 new seats the Republicans lost in the state legislature in Texas.
Correct. Yeah. So exactly. So the point I'm getting to with this is that what this says to me is that there's a very powerful divide in this country right now. So where progressives may not have the influence inside the party they would have had they won, or maybe they will. I mean, we can discuss that. What does it set up for a progressive movement vis-a-vis this kind of very right-wing movement that's very powerful in this country, and the push against the establishment in the Democratic Party? I mean, it's a really fascinating battle America's having politically now. I'm curious where you all think this takes us strategically, and where you think next steps might be. Jacqueline, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that we're still going to have a problem with the establishment Democrats, the corporate-focused Democrats, supporting the insurgent progressive, I mean, because they're the insurgent progressive wing. The Feinsteins and the Pelosi's, they don't want to cede power. So they're not going to be very welcoming of these young upstarts coming into their party, telling them that they have to focus on anti-war. I mean, they really don't want to talk about war because they make too much money from defense contractors. Let's be honest. So they're not going to want to hear that they have to talk about war. They're not going to want to hear that they have to talk about that they really have to put forth an effort and a plan on climate change, even though they'll all say that they're concerned about it. But they're not really going to do much about it because they're still very invested in the fossil fuel industry. They don't want to hear from these young upstarts that they have to really start focusing seriously on health care, on Medicare for all, because after all, these were the same people who did not want to push a public option. So they're not going to change on that. So we're still going to see at the national level this pushback from the corporate Democrats on the people-focused, more progressive, insurgent wing of the Democratic Party. But that does not mean that inroads will not be made in more midterm, more local races, school boards. I look back at the Tea Party, and I've always used this example. After the Tea Party won that first wave of offices after Obama won. Now, there were a lot of horrible reasons that they won, but their strategy was absolutely perfect. And this was an argument that you couldn't make to Democrats because they felt like I was saying that I liked what the Tea Party did. No, I didn't like what they did as far as policy is concerned, but you could not argue that their strategy worked. They went out and they did exactly what Beto O'Rourke did, even though he didn't win, but he wasn't even supposed to place. O'Rourke wasn't even supposed to matter. And he almost won because he campaigned in every single county, every single district in Texas, 200-something odd districts.
And raised a ridiculous amount of money.
Raised a ridiculous amount of money from people. Abrams wasn't even supposed to place. And she became a national phenomenon. Why? Because people went to Georgia, in Georgia, on the ground, knocking on doors, 15,000 doors a day. over the past few weeks. Gillum wasn't even supposed to be a factor, but he became one because of black colleges, because of high school students who were able to vote, because people got engaged. So yes, the corporate Democratic Party, we're still going to see a problem with them. And I actually agree with half of what you say, Eugene. I think
just half?
Just half, because I really feel like Trump, at least the Republican Party, I hate calling his name, the Republican Party, I think the Republican Party is not going to want to push prescription drug price reduction. I don't think they're going to, because that's too close to agreeing with the Democrats on Medicare for all. I think that they're not going to want to do that. But I think they will get the infrastructure bill passed. I think that will happen. And that is what is going to push that person to win the White House in 2020. I do think, though, that this left, insurgent, progressive, grassroots, radical, I think people are going to be less afraid of the word radical. I think people are finally going to figure out, like our parents did, that in order to get anything done, like Abby said, like we all know, social change happens when people get angry and they get in the streets and they show politicians that, no, we know what you're doing and we're not going to let you do it. And it has to be sustained. The anti-war movement has to be rebuilt in this country. It's going to be slow, but it is going to be done. And this isn't going to be done within the Democratic Party. This is going to be done in people's neighborhoods, in organizations like Black Alliance for Peace, in organizations like, Pan-African Community Action, that in churches, in progressive churches, who are now starting to push back on this conservative Christian indoctrination and stealth propaganda campaign that's been going on in white communities and white churches for 60 years. All of this is going to coalesce. It's not going to happen in the corporate Democratic Party, but it is going to happen in the streets, though.
And Abby, I see you shaking your head yes.
I love that you brought up the war machine continuously, because that's what I'm thinking about. I mean, that's the main issue on my mind. Time, of course, looking at domestic and foreign policy through the lens of obviously the U.S. being the largest military machine and responsible for death and destruction around the globe on a daily basis, and especially being the world's largest consumer of energy and the world's largest polluter, frankly. I mean, we're talking about an institution, the Pentagon, that's exempt from all international climate treaties. I mean, it basically is immune from any responsibility from the degradation of the environment. And so I think it's just shocking to even see the lack of really accurately talking about the big picture, right? I mean, just calling out the problem as it so obviously stands. I mean, where's Bernie Sanders on foreign policy? Where's Ocasio-Cortez? I mean, I'm really happy that they've talked about this, but I think it should be a main focal issue. I mean, why is it that here we are in 2018 and we're still not able to address this elephant in the room, that the Pentagon is the largest destructive force on Earth and it's the largest, it's the most responsible for climate change. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're at the precipice of cataclysmic climate catastrophe. And if we're not addressing the actual solution of dismantling the U.S. empire along with its 900 military bases around the world, I don't actually know what we're talking about here. But I really want to also mention that I couldn't agree more. The fight is really in the streets with millions of bodies. And if you look at California, as disheartening as some of these polls and races have become, I think what's amazing is, even in Florida, the felon disenfranchisement overturning, weed being legalized in the past, gay marriage finally being legalized here. I mean, the fact that we went through several iterations of those laws before people really got a grasp on it. And so I think this is the beginning of a really big shift in consciousness here and a people's power movement. I mean, the public bank option, that was just kind of, just new for people. And so hopefully we'll see it next time.
And I think it lost by how much?
It lost pretty overwhelmingly, I think, only 40% to 60, pretty similar to the Prop 10.
That was a ballot measure in Los Angeles, right?
That was a ballot measure central to LA, and that could have been the first public bank other than North Dakota that could have divested from Wall Street. But I think that, again, this is the beginning of something that we're going to see that could really, really take on a life of its own.
But, we have to... Spence. You said it lost overwhelmingly. What we predicted, 40% of the vote? I mean, what do you predicted? I can't, 40%? Like, is it Washington that had a carbon tax that had a car. Now, I don't know what happened there. And maybe that lost too, but there's a political, and I hate to be the one, I'm not hoping change at all, but I'll be damned if I'm not going to be the person saying, okay, let's actually look at this from a standpoint of victory. What does long-term struggle look like? Long-term struggle is like, first we get something on the ballot, people are going to think we're crazy, and then we get it on the ballot, and we lose by a lot. But then we get it on the ballot, we lose a little, and then we get it on the ballot, and we win. Now, that's just talking electorally. There's a lot, politics isn't just about electoral practices. It's not just about elections. But damn, 40%, that's actually something. Right, you're right. And we have to actually articulate that and claim that. We can't just be sitting here because we know Trump is going to articulate this as a victory for him, and it wasn't. Right? He ran on the most explicit racist ads in a generation, and we defeated him. Right? That's something we should be claiming all day, every day. Right? And then again, looking into individual states and saying, okay, the corporate Democrats, they don't know how to fight. I'd be willing to bet if you went into any individual local Democratic meeting, it'd be 3 people and an iPad. Right? I mean, it can be taken, right? So why are we can't act as if all these structures are so overpowering and dominant, and we're the ones with the ass power. We have to stop that.
I think the question is, are we creating a narrative that we can build on? I also want to note Idaho, Nebraska expanded Medicaid. This has actually been, stunning.
Won?
Yeah, both of those won. Every state that has expanded it, it's been tremendously popular. Every state it's been on the ballot, it's actually passed. Minimum wage was not a huge issue this year, but you see a similar sort of trend. So I think there's a narrative out here, even though you aren't winning every race, that you can say, like, obviously access to health care is a major issue. I mean, that's part of the reason why I actually feel very strongly about this prescription drug piece. I mean, last week you have the Congressional Diabetes Caucus releasing like a hard-hitting report on the insulin industry for jacking up prices, which surprised me, but obviously they're setting the stage for legislation that almost certainly will pass. I think that there's a narrative that's starting to build around some of these issues. I mean, you have Amendment 4, which does well and wins. You lose question 1 in issue 1 in Ohio, which was to turn all drug possession charges into misdemeanors from felonies, but to even have that as an issue that was championed by a major party candidate, legalized weed in Michigan. Also worth noting that the gubernatorial Lujan Graham, who won the governorship in New Mexico, also wants to legalize marijuana in that state. Same with Phil Murphy in New Jersey. Same thing, although I don't think this will happen, with J.B. Pritzker in Illinois. So I think we're starting to see that there's a narrative that people are turning a bit. And we'll see what happens with Harris County judges, where they may throw out a bunch of judges who are against bail reform. There's a narrative starting to build here that people are uncomfortable with mass incarceration, uncomfortable with drug prohibition, think that we need better access to health care, that drug prices are too high. And I think if we can seize on some of the center pieces of that narrative, it shows us where a movement has to start to go to turn the ship around.
And that narrative, and one more thing, and that narrative is created by organizations, right? Like the organizations, regular people organizing, articulating something, and then organizing folk, and then taking. And
it deserves to be mentioned. I have to say this really quickly. Rashida Tlaib, who comes from Detroit, where you are, who initially had not the greatest position on Palestine, and organizations who work on this issue, the Electronic Intifada, Jewish Voices for Peace, a number of Muslim organizations, actually interacted with her, reached out to her, some sort of called her out, and she turned her position 180 degrees. And I think it deserves to be said that someone who's called Israel an apartheid state and said that she's for a one-state solution is going to be in Congress. How much that's going to come up, I don't know, but it's a clear example of how mobilization on the ground can really affect a candidate in a key moment.
Let me just jump in here, because Abby, I know you're going to run as well, but I just saw a piece here that, in the context of what everybody just said here, that Nancy Pelosi said she's going to now seek as Speaker bipartisanship. So
exactly what she said in 2006, by the way, when they took it back from Bush, when they said we won't impeach him, we won't raise the taxes.
So, Abby, before you roll, could you again start there, and you can finish up with the comments you just heard here and how all that feeds into that.
I missed that comment. Can you repeat it?
Yes, and Nancy Pelosi says now that she's going to be Speaker, she's going to be pushing bipartisanship.
Oh my good God! Yeah, well, we know we know that the Democrats have basically. I mean, after that she did a town hall where someone asked her, "Would you ever go left on economic issues?" And she almost shook out of her own clothes and said, "We're capitalists. That's the way it is." So I think that as long as Democrats are running on the fumes of Russia fear-mongering and essentially opening their tent to everyone right of center, it's going to be a long road ahead. And so I think we need to really take the framing out of electoral politics for a second and really put it back into the streets, into the formation of these organizations and the groundswell. That's really the only thing, because it's happened under Republican presidents, right? Bush, Reagan, we saw massive immigration reform. And so I think that no matter what happens on the electoral arena, we have to keep people inspired and plugged in instead of just plugging in a vote every 2 years, every 4 years. And it's really not how change is going to happen. So it's really from the ground up. And Democrats really have to open their tent to the left if they want to win. But I think really it's going to come with grassroots insurgent candidates and really grassroots mobilized movements of tens of millions of people in the street pushing for these policies.
Everyone, it's great to have you with us. Look forward to many more talks, and we'll be talking together soon. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for your great coverage.
And now we'll also be joined by Howie Klein, who's a former music producer and a record label executive and progressive activist. He's now an adjunct professor at McGill University in Montreal. And, he's not here. He's almost here. Sorry. I was going to say one of your favorite commentators, Paul Day, but he's not here yet. So we'll get to him before we're out of here. Huh?
Got a great blog name, Down with Tyranny.
Down with Tyranny. Oh, exactly. So I'm just curious, hearing all the conversation we just had here, where you see the struggle going over the next 2 years towards this next presidential election. Democrats have the House. Clearly, we're talking about people working inside the Democratic Party, working outside the Democratic Party, organizing, and where we think this goes. And Paul, we haven't heard from you, which is uncommon here for the last few minutes, so why don't you jump in?
Well, the model I saw in Pennsylvania, I think, is a good one. A lot of the organizing that was going on was not done within the Jess King campaign. It wasn't done within the Democratic Party. It was done with a variety of organizations they've established which decided to support Jess King. But their organizing is going on. Lancaster Stands Up is one of the organizations, and there's some others that are related. I think that's the right model. I don't think you can separate the electoral fight from in the street fight. I don't think you can really mobilize ordinary people without a connection to an electoral fight, because that's where the power is. People understand that. And I think in the streets, too often thinks people marching with signs, but in the streets can also mean in the community. Organizing. On the streets of the community. And that can't just go on, within a few weeks or months before an election. And I think that's the model that's taking place that I saw in Pennsylvania. They're going to be continuing working in the community and getting people, as I say, they're particularly working on people that in the poor sections of the working class and workers that voted for Trump. And there's some towns in this district that I saw that are, exactly that model. And I think we need to raise these conversations with people in these communities. And we can do it as the Real News, and some of the organizing that's going on in Pennsylvania can do it because they're not doing it on behalf of the Democratic Party. They're doing it on behalf of the people of the community, and taking these issues like climate change should not be a partisan issue, but the Republicans have succeeded in making it so. That model is the relationship of community organizing in the streets and electoral struggle, and I mean, we have like 2 years where the fate of humanity to some extent is going to get decided here. If another climate denier gets elected, if it's this climate denier gets reelected, and or a climate compromiser that has the rhetoric but actually won't do anything effectively gets elected, we're in serious trouble as humans, and I think that's a nonpartisan conversation. And I just to say what I said before, when we go and talk to people in the community, they're not children. They need to hear this big picture threat to our existence, to their kids, to their grandchildren. I mean, I did an interview with Rana Foroohar, who writes for the Financial Times, and I asked her, what do the people on Wall Street think? They got kids, they got grandkids, they know this climate thing is for real. What are they thinking? And she said, they all have their escape plans. And they just had to pass a law in New Zealand to stop foreigners from buying land because the billionaires are buying up all the land. They're going to buy up land in northern Ontario and Canada. Working people have to understand that the elites are getting ready to throw them, into the gutter. They're going to have a society with robots doing the work, and the elites go find and protect themselves. I mean, I think they're delusional to think they can really protect themselves, but to a large extent, when you got that much money, you are delusional. We got to tell people this, and I think when we tell the whole truth to people, I think people are going to respond. So
Howie Klein is with us, and we introduced, and also blogs Down with Tyranny, as you said. So Howie, welcome, good to have you here. And I also said that you're one of Paul's favorite political commentators, so welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks.
Paul, since you... First question to Howie.
So Howie, you follow this congressional races in great detail. You've been particularly following the progressive races. So one, how did the progressives do? And two, what do you make of the night?
What happened?
Well, the night isn't over. It's votes are still being counted, and I'm not sure what happened. I mean, I was very disappointed in a lot of races and surprised in some of the others. So I'm still trying to make heads or tail out of it. I was very disappointed that Randy Bryce lost and Wisconsin won. I was very disappointed that what's her name? Jess King lost in Pennsylvania 11, although that was, kind of more expected. But the California races, none of them have been called yet, so we don't know what happened here. And it's really not going to be till tomorrow at the earliest that we'll be able to see. Someone who's been working in this area for many years, a labor guy in Illinois, wrote to me, sent me an email this afternoon, or this evening, I should say, and said, well, what happened? Did the DCCC spend a lot more money on the conservatives than they did on the progressives? And I wrote back just a couple of words, 100 to 1. So if money is, basically what happened is there wasn't much of a wave. It was a little piddling wave. There was all that talk about a tsunami didn't exist. There were some places where, in Pennsylvania, a bunch of, kind of moderate. When I say moderate, I don't mean conservative, but kind of moderate Democrats won, and it was enough for the Democrats to take the House back, which is something. All
right, so Howie, what do you see in terms
of saving the planet? I don't think that was what's going to happen out of this.
Howie, now that the Dems have the House, what do you think they should do with it, and what do you think they're likely to do with it?
They're kind of both. They're likely to investigate Trump in a more serious way, and any way would be a more serious way. So they'll do that. But the Republicans appear to be having a much stronger position in the Senate now, and Trump is running around yelling and hooting and hollering that it was a big victory for him tonight. So I don't know. I imagine there's going to be a lot of deadlock. I know that the American public seems to like deadlock. Before I joined the call, I was listening, and the kind of crucial stuff that you and your guests were just talking about in terms of saving the planet from global warming. That certainly this is not going to be a government that's going to be able to even come close to discussing that or making heads or tail out of it. It's just going to. There's nothing that's going to include Donald Trump that's going to be anything that's going to do anything for anybody except for himself. So it's I don't know. I hope I'll wake up tomorrow morning and won't be as depressed, because I saw there were quite a few nice wins as well. The last time I looked in Iowa, I thought that we might have a big surprise there and get rid of Steve King, but the last time I looked, even that didn't look like it was happening.
The Republicans lost the governorship of Wisconsin. Is that right?
Yep. I mean, I don't know if it's all done, but it looked like they were losing it the last time I looked, and Tammy Baldwin won her seat, so that was really good. I was pretty tied up in the race for Wisconsin's first district. I was one of the people who talked Randy Bryce into running, so I had a big emotional connection to that race. And once he lost that, I kind of lost track of everything else that was happening on some level. Although I'm sitting here and trying to write a post for 5 a.m. tomorrow morning about what happened tonight.
Yeah, there were Walker. It's hard to say what happened in Wisconsin right now. Walker, what we see right now is 49.1%, and Tony Evers is 49%. So that's still too close to call.
It's a real dogfight.
But again, I think that one of the things that we can pick up on, especially when we gather again tomorrow, is looking at how close these races have been, what this means for the future of the political struggle in America, and whose America is it, and where we're going. They've been very tight, and also the ballot questions. And we didn't cover tonight, which we will cover tomorrow, which is what happened down ballot in a lot of races, and the DA's races around the country, state legislative races. That are mirrored here, what happened in Baltimore, Maryland, where young progressives have won in many places. And so it's a very complex question that I think that we have to kind of wrestle with here.
I think there's going to be another thing in the next 2 years, which we'll see. And the foreign policy objective of the Trump administration is clearly to damage or create the conditions for regime change in Iran. Everything they've been doing is leading towards that. I do not think they want to leave the White House without having accomplished something significant in that. And if they think they might be losing the White House, or maybe they think, and I wouldn't rule out some kind of provocation that's blamed on the Iranians, which may also make them think they could win the White House again with some kind of false flag kind of operation. What that means in the House, supposedly the House is supposed to be the one that can authorize war, and part of the problem with the Democratic Party is a section of the Democratic Party, which not in the House but in the Senate, Chuck Schumer represents, and he'll be all gung-ho. When Trump dropped a bomb on Syria, sent the missile to Syria, Schumer said, finally, Trump's looking presidential. On the other hand, there's a lot of people in the House right now who will fight this thing. There is a resolution that Sanders and Ro Khanna put in against the Yemen war. There'll be enough people in the House to wage a fight on this issue. And certainly we're going to be covering that. I think all of a sudden it's going to be really worth covering what goes on in the House.
And we're going to be covering more foreign policy with you tomorrow here on the Real News Network. And Howie Klein, thank you for joining us. Good night. Great to have you all here, and thank you all for being here in the studio. It's been great to have you all join us as part of this conversation this evening. It's been a really good conversation. And I want to remind everybody tomorrow, starting at noon Eastern Standard Time, we'll be going live again to look at what happened around this country with more analysis after we see what happened in these races. We have a chance to kind of look at the numbers and see what the races are, where that takes politics in America in the future. That'll be starting at noon to 2 tomorrow here on the Real News Network. So be sure to tune in for that and watch that. And of course, all this will be on the Real News Network site for all of you to download and watch and listen to and think about where we're going in this country. And I want to thank all of our panelists and all of you for watching. See you all tomorrow. I'm Marc Steiner here for the Real News Network. Take care.